and why is it that there's this sort of veneer of Christian rhetoric and this almost sort of like triumphal, power-oriented Christianity that grabs the headlines, right? And that's a really, really fair question, because I think most people intuitively, and I think whether people are followers of Jesus or not, most people who know anything about Jesus and his teachings intuitively understand that Jesus was not about what a lot of American Christianity looks like.
That's right. Welcome to the All Saints Podcast, a space for all who believe, doubt, and seek. I'm glad you're here. Let's begin. All right. Hey, welcome to the All Saints Podcast. And I'm really excited today to have a really good friend of mine, and that we're going to be talking about some very critical issues that are happening to the church. And so it's my friend, Ron Herms. And welcome, Ron.
Hey, great to see you, Bill.
Yeah, man. Really looking forward to our chat today. So I think it'll bring some clarity to important issues facing the American church. You and I have discussed these topics extensively, and I appreciate you being here to help our All Saints community understand these issues better. So let me take a minute to introduce you properly. So it's my friend Ron Herms, like I already said, a PhD from Durham University. So he's a community advocate, public speaker, scholar, teaching pastor, great dad and husband. He's served in leadership roles for over 3 decades. And in higher education, his roles have included academic dean, associate professor in biblical and theological studies, graduate program director, thesis advisor, and curriculum developer. Until recently, he served Fresno Pacific University as dean of the School of Humanities, Religion, and Social Sciences. And Ron's research interests, which are very appropriate for us today, include early Jewish apocalyptic literature, the Book of Revelation, Christian origins, justice studies, and contemporary apocalyptic expressions in popular culture, like movies, art, literature, environmental concerns, race relations. He and his wife, Kathy, are parents of 5 adult children and 3 grandpets, and my great friend. So Ron, really, really happy you're here. Maybe just give a little bit of an overview before we really jump into it about where we're going to go today.
Yeah, sure. Bill, thank you for the invitation. A warm welcome to the All Saints community. I have known of and dipped in and out of All Saints for about 8 years, between 2006 and 2014, when my family and I lived in Seattle, and I was serving over at Northwest University in Kirkland. So really great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. And yes, you and I have talked about some of these things. I think, one of the things that happens for us in our everyday lives, the daily lives we live, when we have points of contact with Christian communities or other believers, or we see versions or expressions of Christian figures, speakers, celebrities in the news, we then think about, well, how did we get there? And why is it that there's this sort of veneer of Christian rhetoric and this almost sort of like triumphal, power-oriented Christianity that grabs the headlines, right? And that's a really, really fair question, because I think most people intuitively, and I think whether people are followers of Jesus or not, most people who know anything about Jesus and his teachings intuitively understand that Jesus was not about what a lot of American Christianity looks like.
That's right.
And so that just kind of creates a tension, a disconnect, right? But there are some good reasons for why American Christianity has gotten to the place it has, and why it has, especially the Protestant, but there are also Catholic expressions, but especially the Protestant version, and inside of that, especially the evangelical subset of Christianity, why it has gained political, cultural prominence in a way that often seems to stand at odds with the message and the person of Jesus. There's good reasons for that. There's a history behind that. So I think we eventually want to talk about that, and because that's the lived reality, and those are some of the questions people have. But behind all of that is is also a collection of texts that we
Mhm.
call scripture, and a larger world of texts, thinking, ideas, a literary, a cultural, a social world in which the questions of how do people of faith engage or disengage with the powers and the culture, those have been questions that people of faith have been asking for millennia.
Mm.
And especially at certain points, you find evidence of people wrestling with those questions. And I think that apocalypses or ancient Jewish and early Christian apocalyptic literature are really special, helpful examples of what it has looked like in other times for people of faith to wrestle with the question of proximity to power and all of that. So
Yeah.
it feels to me like that's sort of the setup. Like we want to talk about what's going on for us right now, but how we get there is to talk a little bit about how biblical texts have either set us up to expect that or perhaps stand as a critique to that. And we often ignore it because humans love power. So,
Yeah, yeah. I think again, so appropriate. I mean, I get a lot of questions about this stuff, down the line of our conversation. But I think you're right about setting us up to understand how we got here. So let's
right.
get into it.
Yeah.
So you talk about the Bible as an apocalypse. So question: what is empire? How do biblical texts address power structures and systems?
Okay. Yeah, excellent question. So, empire is a word or a concept that we see tossed around a lot, and it refers to the grasping or the ever enlarging expression of power in political, military, and cultural ways.
Mm,
And in the ancient world, and in the expressions that we have of this in biblical literature, we find world powers like Egypt, Assyria, Persia, Babylon, Greece in its various expressions. And then eventually, for readers of the New Testament, the most familiar empire is the Roman Empire.
mm,
These are all ancient examples of expansion. So, and there's an important distinction to make here is that when we're talking about tribes or people groups or nations, we're not talking about something that scriptural traditions thought were inherently bad or concerning or evil. It's only when we get to empire, right,
mhm,
which becomes a different expression of imposing one's will, one's culture, one's desires on other people groups, other nations. That's when the biblical writers, in a variety of places, but especially the prophets and the apocalyptic writers, they suddenly recognize, hey, we have a serious issue here. And so empire is that metastasized desire for human power and control that expresses itself in a phrase that I think we'll all recognize: world domination, right?
mm,
And
mhm,
here's the interesting thing: empires have ways of talking about that which don't use that language. In other words, they have stories and myths about their origins and about their purpose and their project that you and I, when you see through it, would call propaganda, right?
mm.
But so empires have stories they tell. And I've used the ancient examples because we're starting with biblical texts. But even as I'm saying this, I think that we probably have listeners and viewers who are going, I can think of some empires right now in the world. And I think I might be living in one right
Right.
now.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. That's, I don't want to get ahead of myself because, that's exactly what I want to run to, but let's
Yeah.
keep building the background here. So
Yeah.
understanding the social and cultural worlds of biblical apocalypses, why were apocalypses written, and what is distinctive about this genre? Are
Yeah.
there contemporary examples of this genre?
Yeah, excellent. So, as a literary genre, apocalypses appear sort of 200 or 300 years prior to the era of the life of Jesus. And then they fade out again about 150 to 250 years after that. So they have a run of about a 400-year period.
Mm,
And texts like the book of Daniel in the Christian Old Testament or the book of Revelation in the Christian New Testament would be examples of that kind of literature written in that window of time. They're certainly not the only examples. So they're probably the purest example of that genre in our biblical traditions, but they come from a much wider library. And it
Mhm.
is obvious to scholars who study these texts that these apocalyptic writers, so whoever is writing what we call the book of Daniel or the apocalypse of John in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, they're aware of some of these traditions, even if those traditions don't, get into our Bible. So documents like 1 Enoch, which is a collection of early Jewish apocalyptic visions. Documents like 4th Ezra, which is a contemporary of the book of Revelation, written around 100 CE,
Mm.
so about 65 years after the life of Jesus. Same window of time that the book of Revelation is written, but it is a Jewish text, and it's reflecting not on Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus as a Christian text might. It's reflecting on the destruction of the temple 30 years prior.
Mhm.
That's the big crisis. So that gets me to the original question that you asked. Why were these texts written? So they had a certain time frame that they were relevant, and they were written mostly as resistance literature and or as a voice for marginalized communities.
Mm.
So, and I have to be careful how I say how I nuance that, because marginalized to you and I probably means something slightly different.
Mhm.
Anyone in the ancient world who was educated enough to read and write an apocalypse was not on the margins of society where the vast majority of people were illiterate and not operating in the world of texts.
Mm.
Nevertheless, when you are in the crosshairs or on the radar of an empire, even if you're educated, right? Even if you have some other benefits that many others might not, you could still be a marginalized or minoritized community. And so
Mhm.
these apocalyptic texts, they use fantastic images. They use, I wouldn't call it coded language as though it needed to stay a secret, but there's definitely a code or a way of thinking symbolically
Mm.
about the world. And I'll give you just one example. We've
Mhm.
already talked a little bit about ancient examples of empires and possible contemporary examples. And a common image or symbol for an empire in apocalyptic literature in many different texts is to use beast language.
Mm.
So in the book of Revelation, there's a beast that rises from the sea or a beast on the land. In the book of Daniel, there are beasts and they represent worldly powers and empires. And in other early Jewish apocalypses, there are also references to beasts and dragons. And these are, this is not someone who had too much pizza the night before. This is actually intentionally using terrifying, horrifying language
Mm.
that is intended to put, like a more realistic face, or to pull the curtain back on
Mhm.
what's actually going on. And I'll pause here just to define the word apocalypse,
Yeah.
which literally means an unveiling or a revealing by surprise.
Mm.
So, the way you and I might think of that is if you're pulling a curtain back to show something that nobody could see before, apocalypse, right? Or you walk in the house on a cold, snowy Denver day and there's stew cooking on the stovetop and there's a great smell in the room, but you don't know what it is. You lift the lid off the pot,
Okay.
apocalypse, right?
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's revealing this thing by surprise. So that's apocalypses were written as a way of voicing minority or resistance perspectives, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And I'll just say one more thing and then see where you want to follow it up. There are different approaches to resistance in
Mm.
early Jewish apocalypses. Some people are like, we need to grab our guns. We need, and I mean, I'm speaking anachronistically, but we need to fight literally, right? And others would be, well, we need to subversively undermine the empire and kind of quietly, secretly cut out the legs from under it if we can. And then other perspectives would be, God's in charge. This is really bad stuff, but we really can't do anything more than simply be faithful as we define it to be faithful. So we're not going to take up arms. We're not going to try to overthrow the government. We're not going to try to vote anybody in or out. We're just going to wait for God to show up. So you find a range or a spectrum of apocalyptic responses to crisis. But this is crisis literature, it's resistance literature, and it's attempt to reveal the current world and to redefine what it looks like to be faithful to God's purposes.
Yeah, interesting. I was just thinking, so these things seem to show up when there's a problem in the world. Like I'm thinking historically, World War II, World War I, World War II, Great Depression, COVID, like, oh, hey, this is the end, and that
Yeah,
seems to be
right.
kind of a common theme for people, like you're saying. So the response is fight, just sit and wait, hide, whatever. So
Yeah.
really interesting that, and is that true? I mean, is that what happens is if when there's a crisis in the world, the religious, the Christian, whatever, feels like they need to call it what it is,
Yeah.
the lid, apocalypse, surprise, here's COVID,
Yeah, right.
Yeah, interesting.
That's a great observation, and it reminds me that even outside apocalyptic literature as a genre, there were apocalyptic or resistance movements. So, for example, almost contemporary to the book of Daniel and to certain parts of 1 Enoch and other early Jewish apocalypse was the Maccabean Revolt, which was not a literary movement. We can read about it in the Maccabean literature, which is actually in Roman Catholic and Orthodox Bibles in what we call deuterocanonical texts. But the Maccabean texts tell us about this Maccabean revolt, where so from a sense of zeal or religious sensibilities and this kind of righteous indignation rises up, and they turn it into a military movement, and they actually overthrow the Greek overlords for a period of time. And the crisis they're reacting to is the temple being invaded and the desecration of the temple. So putting up what they would have considered idolatrous symbols in the Holy Temple, doing things like sacrificing pork on the altar. They're like, okay, that's a no-go zone, and this is a crisis, and now we're taking up arms, right? So those are the Maccabeans, and that turns into about 100 years of more or less, and I'm simplifying, but Hasmonean rule in Jerusalem that is relatively free of outside forces. But then about 100 years later, the Romans come in under the Roman general Pompey in 63 BCE. So about 55, 60 years before the birth of Jesus, the Romans come in. So by the time Jesus arrives on the scene, he's living now in a Roman world, right?
Okay.
Which has gravitated, has created conquest in the far reaches of the Mediterranean world, which is what empires do. They're always looking for new land. And we might have some clever listeners thinking, wait, I hear people talking about Greenland and Panama and Venezuela and Iran, and that sounds like expansionist empire type language. And I would say, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, when you bring it to today, right? It just gets weirder, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, I got another question here, and maybe we've answered it, I don't know, but how did early Jewish and Christian apocalyptic texts depict and address the political and religious structures of their day? Yeah. And then one more, what strategies for managing the temptations and threats of empires did apocalyptic authors employ?
Yeah, great questions. Let me start with how did they manage those? I think there's several things we can say. The first is in our biblical texts, it's important to recognize that for the most part, the texts that eventually become canonized by the church and are in what we would call our Bible are pretty much in the vein of non-violent resistance, right? So I talked earlier about the spectrum of responses that apocalypses could have, including taking up arms. And if anybody's really interested in that sort of violent expression of apocalypticism, the best thing I could recommend from the Dead Sea Scrolls is the War Scroll, which
Mm.
basically it's almost like military pornography from a Jewish resistance point of view, where they imagine the scenarios of what's it going to look like at the end battle when good is fighting against evil, and ultimately the side of good, which is us, it's always us, right? When the side of good needs a messianic figure, right? That the War Scroll is great for that. And they imagine, and here's a little hockey reference, but they actually imagine it's almost like a 7-game series where, teams in succession keep trading wins, and they
Mm.
get to 3-3. And obviously 7 is a significant number, but in the 7th and final battle, the Messiah comes, the forces of evil are finally and fully laid waste. That is a violent resistance vision
Mm.
in an apocalyptic mode.
Mm-hmm.
But in our Bibles, in Israel's scriptures, and also in Christian scriptures, we basically have retained the nonviolent resistance.
Mm.
And I think the reason for that is, the fancy theological term is, it's Christological, but it's because formed in the way and the teachings and the life and the example of Jesus, we look at these traditions, we're trying to manage the evil and the chaos, and we say, Jesus' way seems to be, sadly for some Christians, but Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount, is blessed are the peacemakers, right? So then step back and say, this has to be at least part and parcel of why we have basically non-violent visions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the things that, just again, to put a little marker in here, why is there so much consternation among especially progressive Christians, but many Christians,
Mm.
with sort of the violent rhetoric of current American evangelical Christianity? It's because we feel that it runs against the grain of the very texts that formed us to value the life and the teachings of Jesus. So one way that early Jewish apocalypse has managed these crises was to recognize that there was what they would in various different ways describe as satanic powers, right? So that there are beasts, there are empires, but behind the beasts are dragons, right? And dragons are now these at least imagined supernatural forces of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And so it actually allows us then to say, well, the problem is not any one person. The problem is that there are forces at work, right? So that's one strategy to manage it. Another strategy is to redefine what winning, what victory looks like, right? And again, based on the life and death, especially of Jesus, the definition of winning is living a self-sacrificial, self-giving, willing to die for one's enemies kind of life. And that comes through in the Apocalypse of John, in the book of Revelation, where the ultimate faithful witness is Jesus, because he laid down his life. And then the followers of Jesus are called, the Greek word is martus, which means a witness, but it's where we get the word martyr or martyrdom from, right? The ultimate example or expression of faithful witness is to give one's life. So that's sort of that's a second strategy, is
Mm-hmm.
to redefine what winning and losing look like. Losing in that vision looks like having all the power, having all the toys, having all the money or the cryptocurrency at the end of the game, right? That looks like losing in this apocalyptic vision.
Yeah.
There's a third strategy, and that is to redefine what leadership looks like.
Mm.
And this has resonance for us today as well, because when
Mm-hmm.
you think about the temptation to gravitate to certain personalities or to celebrity or to fame or wealth or whatever it might be, leadership is redefined, and what it means to be a good shepherd, right? To use Jesus' language from the fourth gospel, where he's critiquing it, and he uses words like thieves and outlaws to describe the most pious religious leaders of his day, right?
Mm.
Which one might say, yeah, I could draw some parallel lines maybe to some Christian leaders today who are behaving at least in Jesus' definition of it, like thieves and outlaws, right?
Yeah.
So apocalypses say, well, where's the real evil in the world? And then they say, well, we have to redefine what winning and losing look like. And then we also really have to redefine what genuine, true shepherding leadership looks like in the world. So that's not exhaustive, but those are three ways.
Yeah. And I don't know, maybe some listeners have maybe heard it and responded like, what you're talking about. But like for me, I've never heard it like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the extremes,
Sure.
we have to fight, we have to defend, that's
Mm-hmm.
normally, especially in my tradition that I come from, that's what I hear, right?
Yeah,
So
sure.
I think, as we've set up this kind of groundwork, now as we kind of jump into apocalypticism in America,
Yeah.
I think, taking this, what you've brought to us now, and saying, all right, how is this playing out here in America right now? So let me throw another question at you. So,
Sure.
why the end times attraction? And, I think of like Frank Peretti, I think of people that, have written all these books on like, we're going to be evacuated out of here, the
Yeah.
rapture. So that, and then the hyper fixation on Israel,
Mm-hmm.
that will be something I'm really curious to hear you talk about.
Yeah.
And then how should we think, about the church's role in the world in this current moment? So I realize we're going to go there, and for our listening audience, I want you to go there. So it's not gonna hurt me or the church or anything like that. So if you're worried about your reputation, bro, I really don't care. So bring it.
No, if I was worried about that, I'd have had to do some things differently about 20 or 25 years ago. So,
Well put.
no, it's all good. And you've asked about 6 questions there, which I think could take 3 or 4 podcasts. But actually, before I respond to any of that, I do want to say, because you responded to what I said last by saying, this is kind of new to me, and I've only lived between these two extremes of we fight, or like we put our heads in the sand and pray for the second coming or something like
Right.
that, right?
Right.
And there are Christian worlds where one of those is like the only response that
Mhm.
that is imagined to be possible. Here's what I want to say about that, though. In America, we have examples in our history of people who chose the Jewish apocalyptic nonviolent resistance way
Mm.
to make change, to call the powers what they were, right? To pull the curtain back and say what's happening, and you and I are Americans. As Americans, what's happening in our country is evil and wicked and colonial and imperial. And here's the problem. We have examples of that, but most white people don't know about it,
Mm-hmm.
or we've only ever read about it in textbooks that sanitized it and gave it a white version because
Yeah.
it was African American and
Mm.
the Black church in America. And then more recently, our Hispanic sisters and brothers coming out of liberation theology traditions, they have consistently been doing this work, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have
Mm-hmm.
shown us that it's possible to make change and to lay down your life and to not take up arms and also to not fold your hands and wait for the second coming. It is possible to
Yeah.
go other ways in a faithful, nonviolent way of resisting.
Mm. Mm.
And if someone were to ask me the question, um, why don't we know those stories better? The answer is racism.
Yeah.
The answer is because the white church doesn't take the Black church and its prophetic voices and our Latino sisters and brothers, and even many of our Asian brothers and sisters, doesn't take them seriously. So yeah, I'll put a bow on that and just say we have examples of that. And so for anyone who thinks, do we have to invent something new? Do we have to like find a whole new way of being Christians in America today? No, no, those templates, those models, those voices exist. And rather than reinventing the wheel, we would do well to listen to people
Mm.
who have already been doing this work and been doing it effectively.
That's the key, right? Listening.
Yeah, right. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to say that as an insert, but then you asked about Israel and the end times, that kind of fascination. And so I think it's important to tell the story of the development and evolution of American evangelicalism over at least a 150-year period.
Mm.
So what we see today, whether it's sort of this co-opting of spaces like the Pentagon or the White House with, the rhetoric of Christian nationalism and the appearance, the sights and the sounds of religiosity, this is not something that has just emerged in the last 10, 12, 15 years. This is something that has been growing and developing for a
Mhm.
very long time. And two things have been happening at the same time. There's been an eschatology. And eschatology, big fancy word, means study of last or final things. So people who are interested in, is Jesus returning, or is the world going to burn, or is God going to do something that kind of just creates a new normal? What's going to happen in the end, right? Those kinds of questions are eschatology. And there's been a fascination with a certain brand of eschatology in American evangelicalism. That's one thing. And then there's been a long-standing fascination with access to power in the
Mm.
American evangelical church as well.
Mhm.
So those two things actually together help explain the current moment. You started by asking about end times. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then about the role that Israel plays in all of that.
Real quick,
Yeah,
and the fascination with looking at modern day Israel and saying this is God's chosen people, therefore as Americans we have to support them, the Christian
yeah,
America. So
right. Yeah, yeah, very good. So a couple things that we can say immediately in response. First, there's a system of eschatological thought called dispensationalism
yep.
that has only existed for about 150 to 175 years. It's
Hmm.
not something that comes from the New Testament scriptures necessarily,
Right.
although that system eventually, as it developed, it proof texted Bible verses. So someone might be listening saying, no, I think that there's evidence in the Bible for this. Well, what's happened is it almost like reverse engineering something. People have gone back later and looked for sound bites in scripture to support a particular way of understanding and reading current events, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But the concept behind dispensationalism is this idea that God works differently at different times or dispensations or ages in history. And that currently, and it's a very neat and tidy system that says there are these 7 ages or dispensations. We're currently in the 6th one, in which God is mostly working with Gentiles and non Jewish believers. And that's why we have the church globally. But ultimately, the goal for God is to get to, stage 7, age 7. And in that age, especially prominent is Israel and the restoration of Israel. So I mentioned earlier that this system of thinking is 150 to 175 years old, and it's based on some really nebulous visions that a Plymouth Brethren pastor by the name of John Nelson Darby had,
Yep.
and also a young 15-year-old girl in his congregation in the 1800s. And basically bringing together his own eclectic reading of scripture and this young girl's visions, he created the seeds of what we now call dispensationalism. But combining that where the culmination is some sort of reconstituting or restoring of a physical geographic national Israel. And
Yeah.
right, and then you can understand the logic of the thought. If God's goal is to restore this one nation that's special to him, then obviously we need to get on board. We need to be part of that project.
Right.
And then one of the justifications is a more general principle that gets drawn from a particular Bible verse. And those who have heard what was it, 3-4 months ago, when Senator Cruz was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he was sort of pressed on the question of how can you give this unquestioning support to Israel? And he kept going back to this one line from Genesis 12, where in verses 1-3, God promises Abram blessing and says that all nations will be blessed through you. And the thinking has emerged that if you want God to bless you, you must bless this entity that God loves, which
Right.
is Abram's family, which is Israel. There's all kinds of illogical leaps and jumps that get made, but I'm just kind of laying that out as the landscape for how people get to that kind of thinking, right?
Hmm.
There's a couple of significant problems with that. The first is, let's actually just read the text carefully.
Hmm.
Israel is not the object of blessing in Genesis 12, 1-3, as though all nations should bow down and bless Israel. Israel is the vehicle through which God blesses all nations. It's
Mm.
actually, like, conceptually, it's the reverse of the way dispensationalist theology thinks, right?
Hmm.
Where everything is focused on God's pet project being Israel. The focus of Genesis 12 is actually the inverse, is that Abram's family becomes a vehicle through which all nations are blessed. Years ago, I had conversation with some of my kids. We were talking about kind of the benefits and the blessings that you get when other people are faithful to God. And I kind of made this comment. I said, God's faithfulness to you isn't only for you. In other words, it's intended to pass through us, which is precisely what God was saying to Abram. So that's one point to make. Here's the second basic biblical interpretation point to make, is that to conflate modern day nation state Israel, which is an atheist, nominally Jewish nation state with no interest really in the God of the Hebrew Bible,
Hmm.
uh, as a nation state. And if we're talking about its government and its political leaders and figures, there's no interest in that in a genuinely faith oriented or religious way.
Right.
There's no vibrant practice of Judaism in sort of the machinery of the military and the government of the nation state of Israel.
Hmm.
The problem is, because it bears the name Israel, and because we have biblical texts that refer to Israel, there's this conflation that brings all of that together and says, well, God said you
Right.
got to bless Israel. So whatever that is, I know it looks terrible. I know what's happening in Gaza. Like, we wouldn't want that to happen to our kids, but we've got to bless it. We've got to support it. We got to keep sending bombs to bomb schools because the Bible says we should bless Israel. That is just a fallacy on so many levels.
Yeah.
And yet there's a system of thinking that says God is interested in this, right? Restoring Israel, and God's blessing to you is dependent on you participating in that project.
Hmm.
And so you put those two things together and people are like, I got no choice. Like, even if I don't like the killing of kids in schools and tent camps and all that, I mean, at the end of the day, they must have had it coming because this is what God wants.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and we can segue to the next question here on Zionism, but it just rings true what you're saying. I'm talking with people that say, I couldn't vote for Kamala Harris because she didn't support Israel. I have to
Right.
vote for the president that's going to support Israel as a evangelical. So I mean, it's interesting that, or not interesting, it's great that you're bringing that up to say, yeah, the conflation here is completely misguided. So let me
Yeah.
segue into the next question. So the history and development of dispensationalism in American religious life. How did American evangelical identity and eschatological significance of the nations in the Eastern Mediterranean region become entwined? I think we talked about that a little bit already.
Mhm.
And then the history and development of Zionism and unqualified support for the modern nation of Israel in American religious life. I mean, we covered some of that, but
Yeah.
just talk a little bit more about Christian Zionism.
Right. So let me start by saying that as a scholar and a teacher of early Jewish literature, the land of Israel, the people, of the land, the history of the land, is incredibly interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I have, over many years taken students on trips and encouraged research into understanding that as a way of understanding these religious texts in our world that we import so much meaning into. And so my thinking is, if you're gonna take the Bible seriously, then you should know something about the world from which the Bible comes. So I have visited Israel. I have many Jewish friends, but I've also visited other countries around the world, Muslim countries, countries that would largely be described atheistic countries. And in all of those settings, you find real people just living real lives. But the fascination with Israel and the rise of Zionism is both a projection of what Americans think is true about us, and also it is a hope. Honestly, even if most Americans can't articulate it this way, it is a hope for world domination.
Mm-hmm.
And there are just crass economic and capitalist reasons for. So early on, the creation of the nation of Israel in 1948, which, by the way, for dispensational theologians was for them, this was like fulfillment of prophecy. The clock started in 1948. They were going to wait 40 years, and in a generation, Jesus was going to come back. 1988 came and went. Then they redefined a generation to be 70 years. 2008 or 2018 came and went, right? And so you just keep moving the goalposts
Right.
to help this system stay relevant and
Mm-hmm.
afloat. But the interest in Israel as a nation and the rise of Zionism is tied to the political project here in America. And early on, the insiders and the promoters of the nation state of Israel recognized that that was something they could capitalize on in the American psyche. And one of the first, so they did create like lobby groups in Washington, D.C., and action groups in New York City. But a significant place that Jewish lobby groups went was to evangelical churches who already had a ready-built eschatology system that would allow them to align with the promotion and the support of Israel and develop what becomes Zionism, right?
Mm.
So to think that every group of people have a right to live in peace somewhere in the world is something I think we should all hold out. So in that basic sense, should Jewish people have a place they could call home? Yes. But then so should Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, right? Then hold that promise out for all people.
Mm-hmm.
But here in America, there's a lobby group, and honestly, you mentioned the Democratic candidate for president in the last election a few moments ago. I honestly don't think that a change in political party in the U.S. fundamentally changes
Correct.
how embedded Zionism is in our political project.
Mm-hmm.
And almost every elected federal politician has some relationship with or some funding support from a lobby group that expects in return unqualified support for whatever Israel does. And you can see that when leaders of Israel come to speak in political contexts here in the US, they cash in on that and they expect that sort of unqualified support. And here's the vehicle or the Trojan horse that has been used to kind of secure that broad support for Zionism. It's the promise of democracy.
Mm.
It's the idea, and for decades of my life, right, the rhetoric has been that there's one democratic state
Yep.
in that Middle Eastern basin or that Mediterranean basin, and support for democracy, if we support that project, what we're really doing is it's self-interest as well. We're supporting our own project and our own aspirations for goodwill and democracy around the world, right? So that's sort of the lie we've told ourselves or the propaganda we've listened to. Anyone who actually goes to Israel and walks the streets, talks to people, knows that it is not a functional democracy the way we think of it.
Hmm.
Yes, they have a seat of government where people vote, where there is representation, and they actually have a much messier system of elections. Sometimes they have 2 or 3 elections in a 4-year period because there's a lot of disagreement and there are more than two political parties. But what they're actually operating with is a system of apartheid. They're operating with a system of a social tier where people, depending on ethnicity and then secondarily on wealth and status, they fit into society in a at least a 5 or 6 tier system,
Hmm.
right? So an ethnic Jew with citizenship is at the top of that pyramid, right? At the bottom is the Palestinian settler with no citizenship, no voting rights, living in a refugee camp because 85 years ago, their great grandparents' property was taken away from them, and they were put in a refugee camp 85 years ago with the promise of new places to live,
Hmm.
even though that's not what they wanted, but with the
Right.
promise of new places to live within about 2 or 3 years period of time. And their great grandchildren are still living in those same refugee camps.
Hmm.
I mean, I've gone a bit afield on that, but why the interest and the fascination is that there's a tremendous amount of finance and capital
Yeah.
that gets poured into this narrative. And I think across our political experience, whether Republican or Democrat, you would largely find people who, at the end of the day, because that's where dollars of support are coming from, would give unqualified support.
Mhm.
And the church in America, unfortunately, has greased the skids for that.
Yeah, it's just fascinating, and kind of hits home with some of the things that at least I've been reading and seeing. So, thank you for that. So let's wrap up with this last question
Yeah,
here,
sure.
because of time here. But and I think this will be really interesting as well. What forces coalesced in the rise of the current conservative evangelical support for the political MAGA movement? There it is. Like the
Mhm.
moral majority, popularity of private religious education, Roe v. Wade, Civil Rights Act, and Voting Rights Act.
Yeah. So I think to make the connection here and ask, how is it that evangelical Christians, a certain kind, have so much access to power today, and especially over the last 10 years of our political life? The answer is that for the better part of 50 years, there have been groups behind the scenes. And I don't want to make this sound conspiratorial, because behind the scenes just meant that they weren't necessarily in the headlines. It doesn't, there was, this was happening. And, you know, you mentioned the moral majority. So they were right out front. And,
Mhm.
and a lot of these early evangelical lobby movements were in response to, and this is the dark side of, it's one of the dark sides of American evangelicalism. The
Mhm.
rise of private colleges and Christian schools and universities in America was originally not so people could have a Christian education. It is so that they could get around the Brown v. the Board of Education decision of 1954 that said you had to integrate schools. And so, as a way of getting around that, there was this movement to privatize. So even settings that I've taught in, Christian higher education, were largely white structures intended to work around the integration of races in America,
Mhm.
which was an attempt to deal with America's original sin, which we just refuse to deal with, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
We wallpaper over it, we make a few steps of progress, and then, as we see just days ago with the repeal of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, then, forward 2 steps, back 3 steps. And within 72 hours, you've got state governors redrawing districts to disenfranchise African American voters. And that's the original sin, right? It's just coming back.
Yeah.
So these movements about 50 years ago used the abortion issue, which prior to that, there was a diversity of belief and conviction on the issue of when does life begin? What do we think about abortion? There was diversity, there was debate and dialogue,
Mhm.
but that became the issue that coalesced conservative evangelical Christian movements. And ultimately, it's a combination of racism and using abortion as a red herring
Mhm.
to coalesce a movement to get back white power. And at the end of 8 years of an African American president, at the beginning of 2017, you see the backlash, and that really, in some ways, is the story of America. It's a pendulum, right? We
Mhm.
we whiplash back and forth.
Yeah.
And for some of us, it really hurts right now because we have really whiplashed into a place of toxicity and racism and suspicion. So for anyone asking the questions of, why are these forces all at work right now, and how does all of this connect? I think we just need to be honest and say that many of the white evangelical Christian structures in America have played a significant part in making our current reality possible.
Yeah, and I mean, and I realize that there's gonna be people hearing this and just like, "Oh, man, come on," it's, why are we going there? It's, with all the, I voted for Republicans because I don't wanna be woke, so why do white people, but I think that's like imperative that we hear that and understand that. And you talked about original sin of America, and
Mhm.
being able to address these things and deal with them, hopefully that brings about, repentance brings about the healing of the American church. So, do you have some resources? I have a couple, but do you have some resources where people can dive deeper on the subject?
Yeah, for sure. So where we started out, early Jewish apocalypses, Book of Daniel, Book of Revelation, how to read apocalypses. There are some resources that I would recommend. There's one called Apocalyptic Literature, a Reader, and it's about 30 years old. But what it does is it goes through different snapshots. It takes excerpts of actual apocalypses, both biblical material and early Jewish material that's not in our Bible, and it gives you like an excerpt of it, and then also some interpretive guidelines for how to read and hear that text. If someone wanted a more detailed approach to that, I had the privilege of editing a 2-volume project called Early Jewish Literature and Anthology. And that includes 8 different genres of early Jewish literature, including romanticized history and poetry and psalms. But apocalyptic literature is a big one.
Yeah.
And there are entries in there that could be helpful to readers. So yeah, certainly could do some of that. On more sort of the rise of dispensationalism
Mhm.
in American evangelicalism, I think the best thing that I'm aware of is a book called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism by Daniel Hummel. And the subtitle is How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation, which is precisely what we were talking about
Mhm.
earlier. And I know you have this as well as a recommendation, Bill, but a volume that I would recommend if people wanted to talk more about how did American religion or religious entities and politics get so intertwined, the book American Apocalypse, right,
Mhm.
is an excellent book to kind of describe how what we think is so shocking and maybe new in the last 10 years has really been going on for more than 125 years.
Yeah.
And so I think that would be a helpful read as well.
Cool. I have got a couple. A book by Catherine Stewart called Money, Lies, and God
Hmm.
is really good to look at the movement to destroy American democracy. It's a little rough,
Uh-huh.
but she does a really
Yep.
good job. And then a great book that I found super helpful, an Atlantic writer named Tim Alberta.
Yep.
He was a church kid. The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. American Evangelicalism in the Age of Extremism.
Right.
Uh, Really helpful. So
And
those,
when you and I were talking, like near the end, when we were talking about over the last 50 years, what are some of the movements that have coalesced? Alberta tells that story
yeah, yeah,
in that book. And that
yeah,
would, I think, be very helpful to readers.
yeah. He's super, super good.
Sort of does it in a chronological way where you can kind of put together the pieces and recognize, oh, I heard about that. That's where that fits into this larger story. So
Yeah, good stuff. Well, we'll have these listed out for everybody in the show notes.
let me give you one more set of
Okay.
recommendations. There was a comment earlier about some of the examples of nonviolent resistance that African American believers and Hispanic believers have been doing for a long time. I would recommend a book called Reading the Bible from the Margins by Miguel de la Torre, which is excellent. I would also highly recommend The Cross and the Lynching Tree by theologian James Cone. And then most of the speeches and sermons of Martin Luther King Jr. are just worth reading, none more so than the letter from the Birmingham jail. So those are also resources that could be helpful.
Right on. Yeah, like I said, we'll have these in the show notes. So
sounds good.
You have to memorize them. All right, Ron, thank you so much. And I'm sure we could probably bring you back and go a little bit deeper on some of these things. But I just want everybody to know we have Ron's contact info in the show notes. So if you have further questions or comments or whatever, Ron's a big boy. He can take it.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone.
Yeah, and Ron, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time. And man, I just appreciate the fact that you come across very matter of fact and caring, kind, compassionate about these issues. So thank you so much.
God loves the world.
Yep.
He loves everyone. And just this last week in the lectionary reading in Acts 17, Paul stands on Mars Hill, on War Hill, right? In the middle of Athens, and says, in him we live and move and have our being. And he's saying it to a bunch of non-Christians that, we all are image bearers and we can do so much better. So yeah, happy to come back anytime. Happy to respond to anybody. Thank you for having me. I appreciate your work, Bill.
Right on. And thanks everybody for being with us and listening. Have a great rest of your day. All right. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for spending time with us. At All Saints, we believe that the biggest questions of life deserve safe and encouraging spaces to be explored. Whether you're feeling deeply in need of healing or just looking for a community where it's okay to wrestle with your faith, you have a place here. So if this conversation resonated with you, don't let it end here. We'd love for you to stay connected. You can visit our home base at BelieveDoubtSeek.org for more resources and blog posts. You can join the conversation by downloading the All Saints app, where you can join our sermon discussion groups and connect with the community. And finally, hit subscribe or follow right here in your podcast player so you never miss an episode. Wherever you're listening from today, take that peace with you. We'll see you next time.